Maintaining existing homes and providing a good landlord service for all existing residents is of course essential. There's another very important part of housing associations' work which can't be overlooked. In a country with a perennial housing crisis driven by an overall lack of supply, the building of new homes and especially new affordable homes can't be left to the market and local authorities alone. For the most recent year on record, housing associations started some 44,000 new homes of all different tenures and completed just over 38,200. But with the National Housing Federation saying that we need at least 90,000 new socially rented homes each year if we're ever going to make any sort of dent at all in the problem, housing associations really need to step up and build as many as we can.
The process of building new homes by housing associations is often referred to simply as development, which means everything from getting land in the first instance through to designing the homes, getting planning permission, then getting them built and finally moving people in.
The process of building a new affordable home is no different to the process of building any home, which is to start with you've got to have something to build it on. So that means buying some land unless you already own some. Then you've got to get permission to build the home, which means going through the planning process, which can be fairly tortuous and is always very expensive. Thirdly, you've got to have somebody to build that home for you, which means finding a contractor who's willing, able and capable to build the type of home that you want. The fourth stage is you've got to manage the process of construction. Even if you're having a kitchen put in your new home, you wouldn't walk away and let your contractor do it without keeping an eye on it. And then lastly, you've got to check the quality of the product to make sure that it meets your needs and the needs of your clients, in other words, your residents.
Now, as we noted in an earlier series, housing associations, in their original incarnation at least, weren't always large-scale builders of new social housing. But all that changed with the 1974 Housing Act, which introduced significant amounts of public funding for housing associations as well as local councils, so they could apply to central government for money with which to build new homes. And as a quick aside, part 2 of that act was titled The Registration of Housing Associations, and that is where we get the term registered provider, or RP, from. The story from there is broadly one of a long march through from the late 1980s, when we left behind a predominantly grant-led model funded by central government, arriving at a mixed funding regime combining reduced grant with private finance. So, cutting a long story short, how is the development of new social housing funded today?
There are two answers. I suppose there's the practical one, so the mechanism by which you deliver funding, and the philosophical one, which is there a decent amount of funding for social homes? And the latter is the easiest because there is absolutely not enough funding for social homes, and there hasn't been since about 1970. In terms of the mechanism of funding social housing, the Treasury gives the government department which is responsible for housing, a sum of money to invest with the people who they call registered providers. And that's because some registered providers are not for profit and some registered providers are for profit. That's a relatively new innovation. The money that's funded through the government department responsible for housing is not enough to build the right amount of social rented housing, and so there has been a loss of social rented housing most years since 1970, and last year the country lost despite recently record building 14,000 social homes. The government department used to give 100% of the funding to deliver a new social home to social landlords to build social rent. Sometimes now that's as low as 25%. So people are critical often of the decisions that boards of housing associations have made. But I think different boards have taken different views about what they want to deliver as organisations. And some of them have thought that any which way you could deliver net additions of homes was a good thing to do. And so they have done an awful lot of private development or an awful lot of shared ownership and relatively small amounts of social rent. Others have taken the view that they need to concentrate what resources they have on delivering social rent. But if you've got a government of whatever stripe, whatever colour, never properly funding social rent, you are never going to deliver the numbers that you need. So the mechanism is it flows to Homes England for most of the country, to the GLA for London. They distribute it to people who've bid to build homes, often particular schemes, but it's never enough.
The majority of it is investment. So effectively we go out to banks and it's very much like getting a mortgage. We effectively know how much income we have to support a loan, and then we take that loan and we build homes with it. There are some other ways. We put in our own subsidy, so effectively we have a reserve of money that we can use to support that, and we also get grant, predominantly from government, but grant rates are very, very kind of small nowadays relative to what they were, say, 20 years ago. So probably only about 10% of the cost of our entire programme will be eligible and receive external government subsidy.
The current Affordable Homes Programme, which is the government's capital funding pot for new affordable housing, runs from 2021 through till 2026 and is worth a total of £11.5 billion over that 5 years. Now, as a quick aside, this sounds like a huge amount of money, and arguably it is, but it's worth bearing in mind that we spend at least twice that every single year, £23 billion every single year, on supporting people, often in private rents, through housing benefit, rather than that money going directly into building new homes, which to me seems entirely backward. But there we go, that is perhaps a story for another day. The Affordable Homes Programme plans to deliver up to 180,000 new homes during that time period. And this is to be split into 50% for a form of discounted rent, so affordable rent or social rent, and 50% for affordable home ownership, the majority of which is likely to take the form of shared ownership. Now, within that, there's a further split. 10% of these new homes to be provided are for supported housing, 10% for homes in rural areas, and 25% will be delivered through strategic partnerships using modern methods of construction, or MMC as it's known, which is typically factory built or new types of modular housing. The programme nationally is administered by Homes England, who are the government's housing and regeneration agency, and they administer and give out all the funds. Now, Homes England describes itself as a, quotes, executive and non-departmental public body sponsored by the Department for Levelling Up Housing and Communities, or in preferably plainer language, they're basically a public body who is publicly funded to deliver a public service, but they are not part of a ministerial department. Rather, they're slightly more free of ministerial control and executive agencies. Similar organisations include NHS England and the Environment Agency, for example. Now, in London, funding is administered separately by the Greater London Authority and via their Homes for Londoners programme, which is a separate programme and a separate pot worth some £4 billion. The devolved authorities, so those in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, also have their own budgets and their own arrangements and administer the funds separately in each country.
There'll be an element of grant from government, which they will give us against each particular home. There will be an element of cross-subsidy where we're perhaps we have an element of sale in a scheme. That money is being used to cross-subsidise sale. And then from our own reserves. So we borrow money on the bond markets and from banks, and we put that money into what we do. Can I give you an example? Last year, we spent, I think it was £508 million on development. 69 million of that was government grant. So we were able, through the other cross-subsidy that I've talked about, we were able to generate a relationship of 6 to 1. So for every pound that was put into a new home, we provided, from government, we provided £6.
At the minute, it feels very much like horse trading sometimes. So you might get some money from the local authority, a pot of money called Right to Buy receipts. You might get some money from the local authority, which is an infrastructure payment that a massive developer who wants no social rent in their building pays to remove their obligation to deliver social homes in the block that they've built. Or you might get something, in the case of a London association, from the GLA. But often you're thinking about how much subsidy do you have to put into that to make it viable, and the judgment is not very viable sometimes, and so how much additional subsidy are we going to put in just to deliver that social good? Often, Islington and Shoreditch Housing Association will identify a particular site where we want to build homes with partners. We're a really community-based local association, so sometimes we'll have got land which has come at a slightly reduced price from a local authority, and they know that we are locally based and community grounded, and that they will be able to nominate the people at the top of their waiting list to those homes when they're built, and it is still cheaper for us to build them than it is for them to build, the local authority to build them themselves. But when we look at sites, what you have to do is you have to do an appraisal about whether you're ever going to get the money in to make that stack up, even over 45 years. So you will look at the price of the land, you look at how much it costs you to build, you look at what rents you'll get or how much you're able to sell shared ownership for, and you'll think about different pots of money that you can bring in.
Finding sites to build new homes is the big challenge, really. As we've said, land is very scarce, and it's the one thing you kind of can't make more of. Also, we are only building affordable homes, so we can't kind of compete in a lot of ways with the Barratts, the Persimmons, the other major house builders. So we have to use whatever angles we can. So we tend to reuse our own asset sites. We've done very successfully. We've built something around 350 homes on land that Eastlight had owned, but we're kind of exhausting that supply. So we are going out now and actually sourcing land directly. We work with agents. We actually have some specific specialist resource that goes and finds it. And usually we're successful where we kind of introduce ourselves and we're getting in there before it gets to the market, if that makes sense. And so, for example, when Eastlight was created, only about 15% of what we were building was effectively controlled by us, where we went and bought the land and entered a build contract and built out the homes. Now it's roughly about 45% of us doing that, and we've had some really good successes recently. So for example, just in the last month or so, we've won a planning appeal to build 70 new homes in Braintree, which we're delighted about, and that is now getting started in earnest.
Now, the money always comes first. Of course, you can't commit to building new homes until you know how you're going to pay for it. But once you do, housing associations can then embark upon the incredibly torturous process of actually getting spades in the ground. And this is where we encounter the planning system for the first time. Now, the key bit of legislation here was the Town and Country Planning Act of 1947, which effectively nationalised the right to develop any land in the UK. And as such, any new building proposals, with very few exceptions, need to secure planning permission from their local authority, their local council, and for them to approve what is going to be built. The idea is that local officials can then review the plans and take a balanced, even-handed view of the need for new affordable housing alongside, say, environmental considerations and community feedback and the other purported benefits of what's being proposed. If they agree, then you can go ahead and get building, and if they don't, you do have a right to appeal. But this whistle-stop tour doesn't really do justice to all that development teams within housing associations have to do before handing over the keys. The process takes months, frequently years, and in some cases even decades. There's a hell of a lot involved.
What's the planning process all about? So the planning process is a mechanism of getting approval to do, pretty much anything. It's about local authorities having control over what is built or not built in their areas. That's where it comes from. The planning process creates things like which areas can residential homes be built in, which areas can employment opportunities be built in, which areas should be recreational, leisure, green space, schools. So it controls every aspect of urban and rural areas. From a development point of view, we have to go through the planning process. If you don't go through the planning process and you build things, planning law also enables the local authority to come along and make you knock it down. So you'd be crazy if you didn't go through the planning process.
The planning process can be really tough. There's a million different kind of variables we need to cap off, and the system can be really difficult to negotiate. So we have not only our own internal staff, we're very specialised in that, but we use professional teams of planning consultants, architects, for example. So what we do is we identify a site, we then look at how many homes can go on that, and we look at what the local authority says about types of homes, how high they are, the size of them, whether they're flats or houses, and we then effectively create a brief for our architect to follow. We then go and talk to the local authority before we do anything about an application, and we get their feedback. And that's really useful, and it's essential because it means that we kind of know what it is they're looking for that site. Once we're happy that we've done all that and we've got all the surveys in, we've talked to the local community, what we then do is we submit the planning application, and then it's determined by the local authority. Either we get approval or we don't, and if we do, that's brilliant, we can move on and build them. If we don't, then we may have to make a decision about whether there are grounds for us to appeal.
Finally, it's probably worth mentioning that buying land yourself and then building the homes yourself is not the only route available to housing associations who want to get hold of new social homes. A key phrase which you might hear bandied around is that of a Section 106 agreement, or sometimes called indirect development, as opposed to the direct development process we've just discussed. This involves a process called planning gain, whereby a private developer will come in and build a number of homes, and then they're effectively forced by the local council to sell some of those to a housing association as affordable housing.
There are two ways that we build homes. One is we go and find sites, or people bring sites to us and we see if we can make them work, and we do. That's quite risky because the whole planning process, it could fall over at any time. It's also really expensive, but the quid pro quo of that is that it means that we build our home that's built to our design guide, which is more sustainable and energy efficient than private sector homes because we build in advance of building regulations. So that's one route of doing it, and we're doing that increasingly. But the other route is what's called Section 106 agreements.
In a nutshell, it's a very strange form of legalised bribery, I think is the best way I would describe it. It's been around for almost 40 years, so it's not new.
So a Section 106 agreement, to be technical, it's Section 106 of the Town and Country Planning Act. And what that means is, if you're a developer and you're building 100 homes, there are various things that you need to kind of give back to get your planning permission.
That could be in the form of as simple as a contribution towards new black railings in the conservation area in the centre of town, right the way through to requiring a proportion of the homes built on that site, a percentage, to be affordable.
Generally, it's around about 30%. So if you're building 100 homes, basically around 30 of those need to be delivered as affordable homes. They are delivered through a housing association.
99.9% of developers are not interested or able to provide affordable homes. They have no infrastructure, they're not geared up to manage rented homes, for example. So effectively they run a beauty contest. They go out to every housing association that they've heard of or that the local authority points them to, and they ask us to bid, and it's the largest pound sign that wins. The difference between Section 106 and land-led development is about quality and design control. If we're doing a land-led development, we control the process from start to finish. So we're there overseeing the design, it's being built to our specification, our requirements, which I would add far exceed what you get in the private sector, right the way through to the production process and out the other end. With a Section 106 agreement product, you're getting the developer product and you're arguing on top for the things that you want in addition. Believe it or not, there are no space standards applicable to private sector homes. There are to our sector. We build to larger standards. So one of the things that we will argue with developers about is the fact that the homes for us simply aren't big enough.
And so that is it. That is it, really. That is it in brief, at least. That's the process for how housing associations build new homes. But as we mentioned at the very beginning of this piece, we as a sector are still currently building just 44,000 homes a year. And yet there is a dire need for about twice that, about 90,000 new social, affordable homes every year if we're ever going to make a dent in the housing crisis. So what more can we do?
A bit of leeway, a bit of slack for housing associations in the planning process would make things a lot easier financially. We pay exactly the same as a developer. We pay Section 106 contributions. They come out of the limited pot of money that we have to produce homes. So easing that would make a great deal of difference in terms of the cost of production of affordable homes. The other elements I think that I would like to see change are, and I'm going to be brutally frank here, and it's a non-political statement, the government needs to put its hand in its pocket. We spend £2.5 billion a year on affordable home productions. We spend £6.6 billion a year on producing prison spaces. That's an equation that's the wrong way round in my book.